Did they dance at the end of the world? It was the 14th century. The Black Death was scything through Europe. One third of the population, maybe half, was gone. Yet, in the margins of manuscripts, on the walls of churches, we see them. Skeletons leading popes and peasants in a final, grim procession. The Danse Macabre. It was a painting, a poem, an idea, but was it ever a dance? People back then believed dance could be a disease, a form of madness. So when everything was falling apart, did they act out their greatest fear? Did they grab a partner and mimic the inevitable march to the grave? We have almost no video from the Middle Ages, and that sounds obvious, but think about what it means. We have no recordings of their music as it was actually played. We have no recordings of their voices, and we have no recordings of them dancing. We have a few instructional manuals written by hand for the very rich from the very end of the period. We have pictures of people holding hands. We have poems that mention dancing. We have furious complaints from priests about people dancing in the churchyard. But the moves themselves, the actual physical steps that a farmer or duchess performed on a summer evening, they are almost entirely lost. They are ghosts, or forgotten. This is a search for those ghosts. We are looking for 20 movements, gestures, and rhythms that have faded from memory. We will piece them together from clues. A word in a song, a complaint in a sermon, the posture of a painted figure. We have to accept that we cannot know for sure. This is not a list of instructions. It is a collection of mysteries. What did it feel like to be in a medieval body, moving to a medieval rhythm? Like, what was the difference between a peasant's stomp and a noble's glide? And when they danced, were they celebrating life, or were they just trying to forget about death for a little while? Number 20 was the first dance a circle. People have always danced in circles. It is a primal shape. It has no beginning and no end. It suggests community, eternity, the sun, a wheel. The most common dance in the early Middle Ages was the carol. The word itself comes from the Greek chorus and the Latin choreo, which just meant to dance in a ring. It was simple. Anyone could join. You held hands, you moved together, the form was straightforward. A leader, the cantor, stood in the middle or at the head of the line. They sang a verse of a story or a song. Then everyone, the whole circle, would sing the chorus back and dance. The steps were likely simple too. A step, step, step close, or a simple skip or walk. The focus was not on fancy footwork. It was on the shared voice and the shared movement. This was the dance of the village green, the festival, the wedding. It was for everyone. We see pictures of it. The 14th century Queen Mary Psalter, a lavishly illustrated book, shows a line of men and women holding hands stepping in time. A musician plays a viol. Their faces are calm. It looks joyful, orderly. This was the ideal. A community in harmony. The carol could be a slow processional dance. It could also be a wild, energetic romp. It depended on the song, the occasion, and the people, but the church had a problem with it. A big one. You know, church leaders hated dancing. They saw it as pagan, lustful, and disorderly. A Dominican friar in the 13th century, Jacques de Vitry, wrote about the carol as a circle whose center was the devil. He said the dancers offered their hands and feet to Satan. In 1209, the Council of Avignon forbade carols from being danced in or near churches. Why? Because people were doing it. They were dancing in the churchyards, during vigils, even inside the church itself. It was a constant battle between official doctrine and popular practice. The carol was more than a dance. It was a social event. It was how you met people. It was how you celebrated a good harvest. It was a way to tell stories through song and movement. It was the bedrock of medieval dance, the common ancestor from which other more complex forms would grow. Like, it was so simple, so fundamental that it was almost invisible. It was just what people did. So what don't we know? If you and I were transported to a village festival in 1250, what would shock us about their carol? Was the singing style nasal and raw, totally alien to our ears? Were the steps always the same, or did every village have its own unique version passed down through generations? And the biggest question of all was the church, right? When the music got loud and the circle moved faster, did these simple dances really unleash something wild and uncontrollable in people? Number 19, did they stomp or did they glide? Imagine a dance floor. Today, it might be a club or a wedding hall. In the 15th century, it was the great hall of the castle. The music starts. But it is not a heavy beat. It is a slow, elegant melody played on a lute and a recorder. The dancers do not jump or leap. They glide. This was the basse danse, or low dance. You know, it was the height of fashion in the courts of Burgundy, and Italy in the 1400s. The name tells you everything. Bass means low. The dancers kept their feet close to the floor. There was no hopping, no skipping, no vulgar displays of energy. It was all about posture, grace, and control. The body was held upright, the movement small and precise. It was a dance of procession and pattern. Couples would move forward, backward, and side to side, performing a sequence of memorized steps. The main source for this is the Brussels manuscript, a beautifully written document from the 1490s that belonged to Margaret of Austria. It lists dozens of choreographies. The steps had simple names: reverence a bow or curtsy, branle a sway, simple a single step, double a series of 3 steps, and reprise a step back. The art was in combining these simple blocks into a seamless, flowing performance. It was a walking dance, but a highly stylized one. It was meant to be beautiful to watch. It was a display of social status. Your ability to perform a basse danse perfectly showed that you were well-bred, educated, and belonged at court. Compare this to what was happening outside the castle walls. We have no manuals for peasant dances, but we have descriptions, mostly from angry clerics. They talk of leaping, stamping, and shameless gestures. The 13th century writer John of Salisbury, in his book Polycraticus, complained about dances that involved wild foot stamping and contortions of the body. This was the opposite of the basse danse. It was high, energetic, and loud. It was connected to the earth. It was about releasing energy, not containing it. So you have 2 different worlds of movement. One is about aspiration, about reaching for a heavenly ideal of grace. The feet barely touch the ground. The other is about grounding, about connecting with the earth with a powerful stomp. One is for the eyes, a performance for an audience. The other is for the body, a release for the participants. The glide of the noble and the stomp of the peasant were 2 different languages of the body. They express 2 different realities, but what are the missing pieces? For the basse danse, the music survives, the step names survive. But the exact style, the qualita, is gone. How did they hold their hands? How much eye contact was allowed? Was it severe and serious, or was there room for a subtle smile? For the peasant stomp, the questions are even bigger. Was it just random chaos, or were there specific traditional steps that we have no record of? Did they have their own choreographies passed down orally, just as complex as the court dances but never written down? And did a noble, watching a peasant festival from a castle window, ever secretly wish they could trade their graceful glide for a single satisfying stomp? Number 18, could a dance be just for listening? It sounds like a strange question. A dance is for dancing, right? But in the Middle Ages, there was a type of music called the estampi. It is one of the very first forms of purely instrumental music that we have written down. It appeared in the 13th and 14th centuries, and its name likely comes from the word estampir, which means toe stamp. This suggests it was a dance, a powerful, rhythmic one. The music itself is hypnotic. It consists of several sections called puncta. Each section is played twice, but with a different ending the first and second time. This structure gives it a driving forward momentum. You can find examples of it in manuscripts like the Chansonnier du Roi, a French collection from around 1300. When you listen to a modern performance of an estampi played on a shawm and a drum, you can feel the pulse. It makes you want to move. But here's the puzzle. No choreographies for the estampi survive. Not a single one. We have the music, but no instructions on how to dance to it. This is very different from the later court dances where the music and the steps were tightly linked. With the estampi, we are left to guess. The name suggests stamping. The music is rhythmic. So it was probably a vigorous dance, maybe a couple dance with strong percussive footwork. Some scholars, like musicologist Willie Apel, have suggested another possibility. Maybe the estampi was not always for dancing. Maybe sometimes it was for listening. Think about it. This was a new thing, complex music without words. In a world dominated by vocal music and songs, a purely instrumental piece would have been a novelty. It might have been a showpiece for talented musicians, a chance to display their skill. People at court might have sat and listened to an estampi in the same way. We might listen to a classical concert today. This idea challenges our assumptions. We tend to think of medieval music as functional for church services, for dancing, for telling stories. The idea of music for its own sake, for pure aesthetic pleasure, seems like a more modern concept. But the estampi suggests it might have existed much earlier. It could have been a dual-purpose art form. On a festival day, you might dance to it. On a quiet evening in the castle hall, you might just sit and appreciate the skill of the players and the intricate melody. This leaves us with some unsettling questions. If it was a dance, what were the steps? Were they so simple and well known that no one bothered to write them down? Or were they improvised on the spot, a spontaneous response to the music? If it was sometimes for listening, how did that change the music? Did musicians play it faster and wilder for dancers and slower and more expressively for a seated audience? And could a piece of music change its function from night to night, being a dance on Friday and a concert on Saturday? How would we even know? Number 17. Did they dance with swords? The idea seems dangerous. A group of men holding sharp steel blades moving in complex patterns. One wrong step could be disastrous. Yet, the sword dance is one of the oldest and most persistent folk traditions in Europe, and it has deep roots in the medieval period. It was a dance of ritual, skill, and symbolic power. These were not duels set to music. They were group dances. The dancers, usually all men, would carry swords. Sometimes they were long swords, sometimes shorter blades. They would weave in and out, forming intricate shapes. A common feature was the lock or rose, where the dancers would interlink their swords to form a star-like shape. This lock could then be held aloft or placed around a dancer's neck in a mock execution. We have early references. A document from Nuremberg, Germany, dated 1350, mentions a sword dance. By the 15th century, records become more common, especially in German-speaking lands. Guilds of craftsmen like smiths or coopers would perform these dances at festivals, particularly during Carnival. It was a display of their group's precision, discipline, and solidarity. They moved as one unit, their swords an extension of their collective will. What did it mean? The symbolism is rich. The swords could represent military prowess, a display of martial skill. The mock execution could be a remnant of an ancient pagan ritual, a symbolic sacrifice to ensure the return of spring and a good harvest. The dance historian and folklorist Violet Alford, in her book Sword Dance and Drama, argued that many of these dances were pre-Christian in origin, a surviving piece of a much older belief system. The dance was a way of taming the violence of the sword, turning a weapon of death into a tool for a creative, life-affirming ritual. The dance was also a spectacle. It was exciting to watch, the glint of steel, the rhythmic clash of blades, the ever-present element of danger. It was street theater. In towns like Zurich, the sword dance was a major civic event. It demonstrated the town's ability to defend itself, showing off the skill and coordination of its men. It was both a ritual and a piece of propaganda. But our knowledge is full of holes. The medieval records tell us that they danced with swords, but not how. The detailed choreographies we have come from much later, from the 17th and 18th centuries. How much did the dance change over 300 years? Were the medieval versions slower, more ritualistic? Or were they faster and more genuinely dangerous? Did accidents happen often? Imagine the pressure of performing a complex pattern with a live blade in front of your whole town. And what was the music like? Was it a simple pipe and drum, a relentless rhythm to guide the dancers' feet, and the clash of their swords? We can see the shadow of the dance, but the living, breathing, dangerous reality is gone. Number 16. What was the language of the hands? So much of medieval dance seems to be about the feet. The basset dance, the estampi, the carol. We focus on the steps, the patterns on the floor, but what were the dancers doing with the upper half of their bodies? What was the language of the hands? In a society governed by strict rules of courtship and social interaction, gesture was everything. You know, we can see hints of it in art. Like look at illustrations of courtly life. When a man and a woman are shown together, their hands are often the focus. He might gently take her fingertips, she might gesture with an open palm. These were not random poses. They were part of a sophisticated code of conduct. Dance was a place where this code was enacted. It was one of few opportunities for a young man and woman to touch, even if it was just holding hands. The Italian dance masters of the 15th century, like Domenico da Piacenza, were obsessed with maniera, or style. It was not enough to know the steps. You had to perform them with the correct air, the correct grace. This involved the whole body, but especially the arms and hands. The arms should be held gracefully, not stiffly. The hands should be relaxed, a flick of the wrist, a turn of the head, a specific way of offering your hand to your partner. These were the details that separated a good dancer from a great one. Think of the reverence, the opening bow or curtsy. It was the first thing you did. It set the tone. A man's bow was a sign of respect. A woman's curtsy was a sign of her grace. The depth of the bow, the way you held your head, the placement of your hands, it all sent a message. It was a silent conversation before the first step was even taken. This idea of gesture was central to the concept of courtly love. Courtly love was a literary and cultural ideal where a knight would devote himself to a noble lady. It was often chaste and idealized. The communication between them was subtle, a glance, a sigh, a poem. Or dance was the physical expression of this ideal. The controlled, respectful touching, the synchronized movements, the exchange of glances. It was a little drama of courtship, played out according to strict rules. But the details are maddeningly vague. Domenico da Piacenza tells his students to move with an area, a fantasmata, minor area, and ghost-like. What does that actually mean in terms of hand gestures? Did they use specific hand signals to communicate with their partners, a silent language that we can no longer understand? When a couple danced, were their hands telling a separate story from their feet, a story of romance or social maneuvering? And how did this differ by region? Was an elegant hand gesture in Milan considered a clumsy one in Paris? The grand movements of the feet were sometimes written down, but the subtle, fleeting language of the hands vanished into thin air. Number 15, did people really dance themselves to death? It sounds like a horror story. A crowd of people gathers in a street. They begin to dance. They cannot stop. They dance for days, weeks. Their feet bleed. They collapse from exhaustion. Some of them die. This was not a myth. It was a real phenomenon in the late Middle Ages, known as the dancing plague or Saint Vitus's dance. The most famous outbreak happened in Strasbourg in 1518. It started with one woman, Frau Trophia, who began dancing in the street. Within a week, dozens had joined her. Within a month, there were hundreds. The authorities were baffled. They consulted physicians who diagnosed the problem as hot blood. Their prescription was not rest, but more dancing. They cleared a marketplace, built a stage, and even hired musicians to keep the dancers moving. They thought the victims would dance the fever out of their systems. It did not work. The dancing continued until people started dying from strokes, heart attacks, and pure exhaustion. This was not an isolated incident. There were other outbreaks, especially in the German-speaking lands and the Low Countries, from the 14th to the 17th century. In 1374, large crowds of people danced uncontrollably for weeks along the Rhine River. They were said to be foaming at the mouth and having hallucinations. What was going on? For centuries, people thought the dancers were part of a religious cult, or that they had been poisoned by ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and can cause spasms and hallucinations. The historian John Waller, in his book A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, offers a different explanation. He argues that it was a case of mass psychogenic illness or mass hysteria. Think of the context. These were times of extreme hardship. Famine, disease, and poverty were rampant. The people of the Rhine region in 1374 and Strasbourg in 1518 were under immense psychological stress. Waller argues that their beliefs created a terrifying feedback loop. They believed in a saint, Saint Vitus, who was said to be able to inflict a dancing curse on people. In a state of extreme distress, people entered a trance-like state. They started to dance. Others saw them, and being under the same stress and sharing the same beliefs, they too fell into the trance. The authorities' reaction in encouraging more dancing only made it worse. This was not a dance move. It was a dance pathology. It was the body expressing a level of stress and terror that the mind could not handle. The movement was not choreographed or graceful. It was convulsive, manic, and desperate. It was the dark side of medieval dance, a reminder that movement could be a symptom of profound suffering. The questions that remain are chilling. What did it feel like to be trapped in your own body, unable to stop moving? Did the dancers feel pain, or was the trance a kind of anesthetic? The records were written by outsiders, by chroniclers and officials who looked on in horror. We have no first-hand accounts from the dancers themselves. What did they see in their hallucinations? And could something like this happen again? In our own age of anxiety and stress, are we immune to the idea of a psychological contagion that expresses itself through the body? Number 14, how did a jester move? In the rigid hierarchy of the medieval court, everyone had their place. The king, the queen, the knights, the ladies. And then there was the fool, or the jester. He stood outside the rules. He could speak truth to power, cloaked in a joke. He was both an insider and an outsider, and his movement, his dance, was a reflection of this unique role. A court jester was often a physical performer. He was an acrobat, a juggler, a musician, and a dancer. But his dance was not the graceful, controlled basset dance of the nobility. It was the opposite. It was a parody. It was exaggerated, clumsy, and often obscene. If the courtly ideal was to glide, the jester's job was to tumble. If the noble's posture was upright and proud, the jester's was crooked and contorted. We see them in the margins of manuscripts, often in strange acrobatic poses, bending over backwards to look through their legs. Doing handstands, their bodies are twisted into unnatural shapes. This was physical comedy. The jester used his body to mock the pretensions of the court. He might mimic a lord's stately walk with a ridiculous lurching gait. He might perform a fool's jig, a wild chaotic solo dance full of leaps, kicks, and spins. This type of movement was part of a tradition that goes back to the Roman mimes and continued through the wandering minstrels and jongleurs of the Middle Ages. These were professional entertainers. Their livelihood depended on their ability to capture an audience's attention. They needed a vocabulary of movement that was dynamic, surprising, and often shocking. The historian Beatrice K. Otto, in her book Fools Are Everywhere, highlights that the fool's performance was a mixture of skill and subversion. They were often highly skilled acrobats, but they used that skill to appear unskilled and chaotic. The fool's dance was also a form of social commentary. By inverting the graceful movements of the court, the jester was holding up a mirror to the aristocracy. He was saying, look at how seriously you take yourselves. Look at these stiff, unnatural poses you adopt. His dance was a reminder of the raw, untamed body that existed beneath the fine clothes and courtly manners. It was a release valve for the repressed energies of the court, but what did this fool's jig actually look like? The term is a catch-all. Did each jester have his own signature moves? Was it pure improvisation, or were there stock comedic routines that were passed down from one fool to another? We have the images of their contortions, but we don't know the flow, the rhythm, the timing that turned an acrobatic trick into a piece of hilarious social satire. And how did the audience react? Did they laugh freely, or was there a nervous edge to their laughter, a recognition that the fool's chaotic energy could be genuinely disruptive to their orderly world? The jester's dance is a phantom, a parody of a dance that we can barely reconstruct itself. Number 13, was there a dance of the Moors? In the courts and town squares of late medieval Europe, a strange and exotic spectacle sometimes took place. Dancers would appear with their faces blackened with soot. They would wear bells on their ankles and wrists, and wave colorful scarves. Their dance was energetic, full of leaps and percussive stamps. This was the Moresca, or Moorish dance. The Moresca was a type of character dance. It was a European fantasy of what Moorish or Saracen culture was like. It had very little to do with actual North African or Middle Eastern dance. It was a product of the European imagination, shaped by centuries of conflict and trade during the Crusades and the Reconquista in Spain. It was a way of representing the other. The dance often took the form of a mock battle. There would be two groups of dancers, one representing Christians and the other Moors. They would perform a choreographed fight, clashing wooden swords or sticks. The dance always ended with the victory of the Christians. It was a piece of theatrical propaganda reaffirming Christian dominance. It was particularly popular in the 15th and 16th centuries, becoming a standard feature of court entertainments and civic pageants. An entry in the accounts for a London Brewers Guild from 1427 records a payment for a Morisque danse. But it was not always a battle. Sometimes the Moresca was a solo performance by a dancer in Moorish costume, often as part of a larger play or entertainment. This solo version was often wild and grotesque, emphasizing the supposed savagery of the character. The bells on the dancer's legs were a key feature. They turned the dancer into a percussion instrument, their every step and leap creating a jingling, rhythmic soundtrack. The dance historian Robert Mullally has studied the Moresca extensively. He notes that it was a versatile form. It could be a serious part of a religious play, a comedic interlude in a court masca, or a rowdy folk custom. This adaptability is why it was so popular for so long. It could be whatever the performers and the audience needed it to be, a celebration of victory, a strange and exotic spectacle, or just a chance to make a lot of noise. The questions surrounding the Moresca are uncomfortable ones. We have the costumes, the bells, the blackened faces. But what were the actual steps? Were they borrowed from European folk dances and just given a new exotic framing? Or did they try to imitate movements they had heard about from travelers or seen in imported art? How did the performers feel about blackening their faces? Was it seen as a simple costume, like wearing a mask, or did they understand its power to dehumanize and stereotype? And most importantly, did any actual person from North Africa or the Middle East ever see a Maresa performance? And if so, what did they think of this bizarre, jingling caricature of their culture? Or number 12, did you have to dance in a straight line? Not all dances were in a circle. Imagine a line of people holding hands or with their hands on the shoulders of the person in front. A leader at the front guides them, snaking through the village streets, in and out of houses, around the bonfire. This was the farandole. It was a chain dance, a dance of procession, and it was ancient. The farandole is strongly associated with Provence, in the south of France, but similar chain dances existed all over Europe. Unlike the carol, which was contained in a circle, the farandole was a journey. The dance moved through space. It was a living, moving line that could stretch for hundreds of feet. The steps were simple, usually a pattern of skips or runs, so that everyone could keep up. The energy came from the leader. The leader improvised the path, creating spirals, arches by joining hands with another dancer for people to pass under, and intricate winding patterns. The 14th century writer Jean Froissart describes a festival in Amiens where the dancers formed a long chain and danced through the town. This was a dance that broke down barriers. It connected different parts of the community. By dancing through the streets and into people's homes, the farandole symbolically united the public and private spaces of the village. It was a dance of communal celebration. The music was key. It was typically played on a pipe and a tabor, a small drum. A single musician could play both instruments at once, a pipe in one hand and a stick for the tabor in the other. This made the musician mobile. They could walk at the head of the line, providing a constant driving rhythm for the dancers to follow. The sound of the pipe and tabor became the sound of festival and celebration. This form of dance emphasized the collective over the individual. You were part of a chain, a single organism. Your movement was dictated by the person in front of you and the person behind you. There was little room for solo improvisation, except for the leader. It was about the power of the group moving as one. Folklorists like Alan Lomax developed a theory called cantometrics, which links song and dance styles to social structures. A dance like the farandole, with its single unified line, reflects a tightly knit, cooperative society. But what are the missing details? When the line went into a house, what did they do? Did they just pass through, or did they stop and perform a specific figure? How was the leader chosen? Was it the best dancer, the village elder, or just the most charismatic person at the festival? We know the shape of the dance, a line, but we don't know its texture. Was it a joyous, laughing procession, or did it have a more solemn, ritualistic feeling, especially if it was part of a religious festival? And when the line spiraled in on itself, creating a tight knot of people in the village square, what was the feeling at the center of that human labyrinth? Number 11, could you leap your way to heaven? The best dance was low, courtly, and controlled. But the courts had another, wilder dance. It was called the saltarello. The name comes from the Italian verb saltare, which means to jump. And that is exactly what it was, a jumping dance. It was the energetic, high counterpart to the low dance. The saltarello was popular in Italy, Spain, and France in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. It was often performed after a slow, processional dance like the pavane or the basse danse. The contrast would have been dramatic. After the gliding, controlled movements, the music would speed up, and the dancers would launch into a series of lively hops, skips, and leaps. It was a moment of release, a chance to show off your energy and athleticism. We have some surviving music for the saltarello. Several examples are found in a 14th century Italian manuscript, now in the British Library ad, MS 29987. The music is fast, in a triple meter, with a catchy, repetitive rhythm that feels perfect for jumping. When you listen to it, you can easily imagine a room full of brightly dressed courtiers joyfully hopping and spinning. Thoino Arbo, in his 1589 dance manual Orchesography, describes the steps for the saltarello. Even though he was writing later, he was describing a dance that had been around for a long time. His instructions involve a series of kicks and jumps, with the dancer landing lightly on their feet. It required skill and stamina. It was cheerful, flirtatious, and fun. It was the party dance of the aristocracy. But the jump itself had a deeper significance. Like, in a world where the social ideal was control and composure, the act of leaping into the air was a small act of rebellion. It was a moment of freedom, a brief defiance of gravity. For the man, it was a chance to display his vigor and strength. For the woman, it was a chance to show her lightness and grace, her skirt swirling around her. The dance historian Ingrid Bernard has pointed out the social importance of these alta danza, or high dances. They were not just about fun, they were about demonstrating the physical vitality of the ruling class. But how high did they actually jump? Arbo's manual gives us the steps, but not the style. Were the leaps big and athletic, or were they small, contained hops? Did men and women jump in the same way? The illustrations we have are often stylized and not very helpful. And what about the risk? Dancing on stone or wood floors and leather-soled shoes, a bad landing from a leap could easily result in a twisted ankle. Was it a dance-controlled risk? And did the church, which so hated the wild leaping of the peasants, look more kindly on the jumping of the nobility? Or was a moment of ungodly abandon, no matter how expensive your clothes were? Number 10. Did the king ever dance alone? The image of medieval dance is almost always communal. The circle of the carol, the chain of the farandole, the couples of the bastance. But was there a place for the solo dancer? Was there a moment when one person held the attention of the entire room? The answer is yes, and it was often in a dance called the duktia. The duktia is a mysterious dance. We have a handful of musical pieces from the 13th century that are labeled duksha. Like the estampi, they are purely instrumental. The music is light, cheerful, and has a clear, danceable rhythm. Johannes de Grocheo, a Parisian music theorist, writing around 1300, is our main source of information. He tells us a few crucial things. He says the duktia was played at festivals, and that it was a light and nimble dance. He also says it could be danced by young men and women. But what was the form? Grocheo's description is brief. He contrasts it with the estampi, suggesting it was simpler and had a more regular rhythm. Some historians, like Patricia Rader, have interpreted the evidence to suggest that the duktia might have been a solo or a couple dance that involved a lot of virtuosity. Perhaps it was a show-off piece. Imagine a break in the evening's festivities. The large group dances stop. A single musician steps forward. A single dancer, or perhaps a couple known for their skill, takes the floor. The duktia begins. The dancer performs a series of quick, intricate steps, spins, and graceful gestures. It would be a moment of individual expression, a stark contrast to the collective movement of the other dances. It would be a chance for a person to display their personal grace, skill, and charisma. This kind of solo performance was more common for professional entertainers, the jongleurs. But Grocheo suggests that juvenes et puellae, young men and women of the court, also danced it. This implies it was part of the social dance repertoire, not just a stage act. It might have been a kind of friendly competition, a dance-off where individuals could show their best moves. The existence of the duktia complicates our picture of medieval dance. It shows that it was not all about group solidarity and conformity. There was also space for the individual to shine. It was a precursor to the solo variations that would become a key feature of later ballet. But the mystery is immense. We have a name and a few pieces of music. That is all. What were the steps? Were they improvised or choreographed? Grocheo mentions a ductus, which implies a leading or pulling movement. Was it a dance where one partner led the other through a series of figures? If it was a solo, was it performed by men and women equally? And what was the social risk of a solo dance? If you performed well, you gained status, but if you stumbled, you made a fool of yourself in front of the entire court. The ductio was a moment of high stakes, and we will never know who soared and who fell. Number 9, could a dance be a prayer? We think of dance and religion as separate, even opposing forces in the Middle Ages. The church condemned dancing, but the story is more complicated. There were moments when movement and faith came together. Think of the religious pilgrimage. It was a long journey on foot to a holy shrine, like Santiago de Compostela in Spain or Canterbury in England. And this journey involved its own kind of rhythmic communal movement. Pilgrims often traveled in groups. They would sing songs to pass the time and keep their spirits up. These songs, like the famous pilgrim songs from the Liber Vermel de Montserrat, a 14th century Spanish manuscript, have simple, repetitive melodies and strong rhythms. The manuscript itself says that the pilgrims at Montserrat like to sing and dance, and it provides some songs for the dancing of the pilgrims in a circle. This was not a wild secular dance. It was a dance with a religious purpose. It was a form of communal prayer, a way of expressing shared faith through the body. The steps were likely very simple. a walking or shuffling step that could be done by people who were weary from a long journey. The circular form, as in the carol, created a sense of unity and spiritual focus. It was a world away from the shameless dances condemned by priests. Beyond pilgrimage, there was a strange, controversial tradition of liturgical dance. Yes, dancing within the church service itself. It was rare and often suppressed, but it existed. The most famous example is the Dance of the Choir Boys Los Cises in the Cathedral of Seville, a tradition that is said to date back to the 15th century and, remarkably, continues to this day. They perform a solemn patterned dance with castanets at certain religious festivals. The scholar and dancer Gloriana St. Clair has researched the evidence for liturgical dance in the medieval period. While she concludes that full-blown dancing was not a standard part of the liturgy, she points to the highly ritualized and choreographed movement of the priests and assistants during the Mass. The processions, the bows, the genuflections, these were all a form of stylized symbolic gesture. It was a kind of slow, sacred choreography. The line between ritual and dance could sometimes be very thin. So a medieval person could experience movement as a spiritual practice. A pilgrim's shuffle, a solemn procession, a round dance to a sacred song. This was the body and service of the soul, but our understanding is so fragmented. For the pilgrim dances at Montserrat, the manuscript gives us the music and says, dance in a circle, but what were the steps? Was there a specific mood they were trying to create? Joyful, meditative, penitent. For the liturgical dances, the records are often hostile, written by bishops trying to ban the practice. What did these forbidden church dances actually look like? Were they based on popular folk dances, adapted for a sacred space? And what did the average person in the pews feel when they saw a dance happening in front of the altar? Did they see it as blasphemy or as a powerful and direct way of praising God? Number 8, how did you sway? Not all dances are about footwork. Sometimes the core movement is simpler, a basic shift of weight from side to side. This was the branle. The name comes from the French verb branler, which means to sway, shake, or rock. It was a dance that started in the late Middle Ages and became incredibly popular in the 16th century. Its roots, however, are in the simple, swaying chain dances of the medieval period. The branle was a group dance. Dancers stood in a line or a circle holding hands. The basic movement was a double step to the left, followed by a double step to the right. It was a simple, rocking motion. But this basic foundation could be decorated in endless ways. You could add hops, kicks, turns, or claps. Foino Arbo, in orchesography, gives us a detailed picture of the branle in its later, more developed form. He describes dozens of variations. There was the simple double branle. There was the lively gay branle. There was the Cassandre branle, which involved a slow tottering step, mimicking an old man. There was the washerwomen's branle, which included hand gestures that imitated the scrubbing and wringing of laundry. This shows that the branle was a highly adaptable dance. It could be simple and communal, just a gentle sway, or it could be a complex piece of character theater. It was often performed in a suite, starting with the simplest version and progressing to the more complex and energetic variations. A whole evening's entertainment could be built around the branle. Its medieval origins are in the swaying carols and chain dances we have already seen. The name itself starts to appear in documents in the 15th century. It represented a move away from the purely processional dances, like the basse danse, towards something with a more lively side-to-side feel. It was less formal, more social. It was a dance you could chat during. The regional variations were a key feature. Arbo describes branles from different parts of France, like the Haute-Barrois branle or the Scottish branle. Each region had its own distinctive style, its own unique steps and music. A branle was a kind of local accent expressed in dance. It was a way of affirming your regional identity. But what about the early medieval branle? Arbo was writing at the end of a long evolution. What did the 15th century version look like? Was it just a simple side-to-side sway without all the fancy variations? How did that simple sway evolve into the complex choreographies Arbo describes? Was there one master branle that all the others came from? Or did different swaying dances develop independently in different regions? And what did it feel like to be in that long swaying line of people, moving together like a field of wheat in the wind? Was it hypnotic, comforting? We know the step, but we don't know the feeling. Number 7, could you dance a story without words? Before movies, before television, how did people tell stories to a mass audience? They used songs, poems, and plays, and they used dance. A lot of medieval dance was abstract, a series of patterns and steps. But some of it was pantomimic, it told a story. The movements were not just movements, they were actions. We have already seen this in the Moresca, which told a story of a battle, and in the character Brannels, which imitated washerwomen or old men. This kind of storytelling dance was a huge part of folk and courtly entertainment. At a banquet, a group of dancers might perform a short, silent play, a ballet before the word existed. A famous example is the Charivari or Chivalry. This was a noisy, disruptive folk custom, a kind of community-led street theater. If someone in the village did something the community disapproved of, like an old man marrying a young woman, a group of people would gather outside their house at night, banging pots and pans, and performing a crude mocking dance drama. The movements would be exaggerated and grotesque, lampooning the unfortunate couple. It was a form of social control, a story told through dance to enforce community norms. In the court, the pantomime was more refined. A 1489 letter from the Duke of Milan's ambassador describes an entertainment at the English court of Henry VII. It included a dance performed by 12 men and 12 women, dressed as the 12 months of the year. Each dancer would have performed movements characteristic of their month: shivering for January, planting for April, harvesting for August. It was a moving calendar, a story of the turning of the seasons told through the body. The dance historian and reconstructionist Anne Kipling Brown has worked on recreating these kinds of narrative dances. The challenge is immense because the sources rarely describe the specific gestures. They might say the dancers imitated the actions of laborers, but they don't say how. Did they use realistic gestures, or were they highly stylized and symbolic? This kind of dance required a different skill from the abstract dances. A dancer had to be an actor. They had to use their face, their hands, their entire body to convey character and plot without words. It was a silent language that a medieval audience accustomed to symbolism and allegory would have been able to read fluently. But for us, the language is almost completely lost. When a dancer performed the story of a famous knight, what were the key gestures that represented bravery, or love, or betrayal? Was there a standardized vocabulary of pantomimic gestures that all performers knew, like a medieval sign language for dancers? How much was left to the individual dancer's interpretation? And when the audience watched the washerwoman's Brannel, were they just amused by the funny gestures, or did they also see a commentary on the hard lives of working women? The stories are gone, and we are left with only the faintest echo of their movements. Number 6, was it always done in couples? The courtly dance is the dance of the couple, a man and a woman moving together, a perfect picture of social harmony. The basse danse, the saltarello, is they are built around the partnership, but was this the only way? What about a dance for three? In the Italian dance manuals of the 15th century, written by masters like Domenico da Piacenza and Guglielmo Ebreo da Pesaro, we find a number of choreographies for 3 dancers. These were called ballo a tre. They were usually for 2 men and 1 woman, or 2 women and 1 man. These were not simple chain dances, they were complex, intricate choreographies designed to show off the skill of the dancers. The patterns were fascinating. The 3 dancers would weave around each other, separate, and come back together. The 2 men might compete for the attention of the woman, or the 2 women might dance in perfect unison, flanking the man. The geometry of the dance was constantly shifting. One famous example is the dance for Seppi, choreographed by Domenico. It is for 2 men and 1 woman. It includes sections where the woman dances between the 2 men and moments where the men perform vigorous, leaping steps to display their prowess. It is a mini drama of courtship and rivalry. It is far more complex, both emotionally and spatially, than a simple couple dance. Why dance in threes? It created visual interest. It was more theatrical, more of a spectacle for the audience to watch. It also allowed for more complex storytelling, a couple dances about harmony or seduction. A dance for 3 can be about jealousy, choice, friendship, or competition. It opened up a new range of expressive possibilities. The dance historian Jennifer Navile has written about the importance of these ballo in 15th century Italian courts. She argues that they were more than just dances, they were social rituals that reflected the complex web of relationships at court. Who you danced with and in what configuration said a lot about your status and your alliances. Performing a ballo a tree successfully was a sign that you were at the very center of the court's social life. But these dances are incredibly difficult to reconstruct. The instructions are often cryptic. Domenico might write the two of them do a saltarello together while the other waits. But what does that look like in practice? How do three people share the space? How do they manage their focus and eyeline? Are the two men supposed to be rivals, or are they friends performing for the lady? The emotional subtext, which would have been obvious to a 15th century courtier, is completely hidden from us. We have the floor plan, but we have lost the architecture of the relationships. Number 5, what did it mean to turn? The spin, the turn, the pirouette. It is one of the most exciting movements in dance. It is a moment of dizzying energy, a display of balance and control, and it was very much a part of the medieval dancer's vocabulary. You know, we see it in the energetic dances, the saltarello, the galliard, a later dance with medieval roots, the fool's jig thing. They all involve turns. A quick spin could be a punctuation mark in a phrase of steps, a flourish at the end of a sequence. For a couple, a turn could be a moment of intimate connection as the man guided the woman through a rotation. Ithoino Arbo describes the turn in the galliard in great detail. The galliard was a vigorous dance in triple time, famous for its cinque pas or 5 steps, the last of which was a big leap. Within the dance, there were opportunities for turns. He describes how a dancer could turn in the air during the leap, a move that required significant athleticism. But the turn was more than just a physical feat. It had symbolic weight. In a world with a strong sense of direction facing the altar in church, facing the king at court, a deliberate turn could be a significant act. To turn your back on someone was an insult. To turn with someone in a dance was a sign of agreement, of partnership. The turn also had a psychological effect. Spinning can induce a change in consciousness. It can make you dizzy, disoriented, euphoric. Think of the whirling dervishes of the Sufi tradition, a practice that also has medieval roots. Their constant turning is a form of spiritual meditation, a way to achieve a state of religious ecstasy. While a courtly turn was not a religious ritual, it might have contained a tiny echo of that feeling of transcendence, a momentary loss of control in a world obsessed with it. The music theorist Johannes de Tinctoris, writing in the 1470s, linked certain emotions to different types of movement. He saw leaping and turning as expressions of joy. The turn was the physical embodiment of a light heart. But how did they actually do it? We don't have instructions on technique like a modern ballet manual. Did they spot, focusing their eyes on one point to avoid getting dizzy, a technique all modern dancers use? Or did they just embrace the dizziness? How fast did they turn? Were the turns in the peasant dances wild, abandoned spins, while the courtly turns were slow, controlled rotations? And when a dancer spun, did they feel a sense of power and release, or a fear of losing their balance and their dignity in front of everyone? The simple act of turning is one of the great unknowns in the physical experience of medieval dance. Number 4. How did a dance begin and end? Every dance has a beginning and an end. They are the frame. They signal the transition from everyday life into the special world of the dance, and then back again. In the Middle Ages, these moments were formalized and full of social meaning. The first and last moves were often the most important. The beginning was the reverence. We have mentioned it before, but it is worth focusing on. It was a bow or a curtsy. But it was more than just a greeting. It was a formal acknowledgement of your partner and your audience. It established the tone of the dance. In the basse danse, the reverence was a slow, graceful movement. The man would sweep one leg back, bend his knee, and bow his head. The woman would bend her knees in a curtsy, keeping her back straight. The dance manuals of the 15th century are very clear about the importance of the reverence. It was the foundation of good dancing. If you could not perform a proper reverence, you had no business being on the dance floor. It was a test of your breeding and education. It was also a moment of negotiation. The depth of the bow could signal the degree of respect you were showing to your partner, which was especially important if they were of a higher social rank. The end of the dance was just as important. After the final step, there would often be another reverence. This closed the frame. It was a thank you to your partner and a final acknowledgement of the audience. It was a way of saying the performance is over, but there was another way a dance could end with a kiss. This sounds shocking to us, but it was a common feature of many medieval folk dances. The carol and other round dances often concluded with the dancers kissing. This was not necessarily a romantic or sexual kiss. The kiss in the Middle Ages was often a formal ritual gesture. It could be a sign of peace, the pax or kiss of peace in a church service, a sign of fealty, or a sign of social fellowship. Of course, the church hated this. The 13th century Bishop of Salisbury, Richard Poore, condemned carols that ended with a kiss of wantonness. The line between a ritual kiss of fellowship and a more amorous one was obviously very thin, and it was a source of constant anxiety for moralists. But for the dancers, it was a normal, expected part of the celebration. It sealed the communal bond that the dance had created. So we have the formal frame of the reverence and the intimate frame of the kiss. But what did they feel like when a young knight bowed to a great duchess? Was his heart pounding with fear of making a mistake? Was the reverence a moment of pure terror? And the kiss at the end of the village dancer, was it a quick, formal peck, or was it a moment of genuine human warmth and connection? Could you refuse to kiss someone? What happened then? The official rules are there in the books, but the human drama that unfolded in those first and last moments is lost to us forever. Number 3, could your clothes dictate your moves? We often think of dance as the free movement of the body, but a medieval dancer was never free. Their body was constrained, shaped, and defined by the clothes they wore. The fashion of the day was not just a matter of style, it was a physical reality that dictated how a person could move. A forgotten dance move might not be a step at all, but a way of moving that was created by a specific garment. Consider the dress of a noblewoman in the 15th century. She might wear a long, heavy gown made of velvet or brocade, with a train that trailed on the floor behind her. The sleeves could be long and flowing, or tight and restrictive. On her head, she might wear a hennin, a tall, conical hat with a veil. Now, try to dance in that. You cannot leap or kick. You would trip on your own dress. You cannot make large, sweeping arm gestures. You would get tangled in your own sleeves. The train required constant management. A specific small kick, called the ruade by some modern scholars, might have been used to flick the train out of the way before turning. Your posture had to be perfectly upright to balance the hennin. The clothing forced you into the style of the Baston's small steps, controlled gestures, a gliding motion. The historian Sarah Grace Heller, in her book Fashion in Medieval France, argues that clothing and movement were inextricably linked. The ideal of noble grace was both expressed and created by the clothes. You moved gracefully because your clothes forced you to. Now think of a peasant. A man would wear a simple tunic and hose. A woman would wear a practical kirtle or dress, likely calf length. Their feet might be bare or in simple leather shoes. They had freedom of movement. They could run, jump, and stamp their feet. Their clothes allowed for the energetic, high dances that the nobility, in their restrictive finery, could not perform. So, clothing was a kind of choreographer. It determined the vocabulary of movement available to a person. A long sleeve was not just a long sleeve, it was a partner in the dance, something to be managed and displayed. A noble woman, gesturing with her flowing sleeve, was using her costume as part of the performance. This link between clothing and movement raises some fascinating questions. When fashions changed, did dance styles change as well? Did the introduction of a new type of sleeve lead to the invention of a new arm gesture? We have detailed records of what they wore, and we have some records of how they danced. But the connection, the direct physical experience of dancing in those clothes is what we lack. Could we understand medieval dance better if we tried to reconstruct it while wearing accurately reconstructed medieval clothing? Would we discover forgotten moves that are not steps, but are actually techniques for managing a train or turning without losing your hat? Number 2 was the most important move, just walking. It sounds anticlimactic. After all the leaps, turns, and sways, could the most significant move be the one we do every day? In the context of medieval court dance, the answer might be yes. The simple act of walking was transformed into a complex and meaningful art form. The bastance, at its core, was a stylized walk. The simples and doubles that formed its basic units were just patterns of walking steps, 1 step forward or 3 steps forward. But it was how you did it that mattered. The Italian master Domenico da Piacenza wrote that a dancer must have misura, or measure. This meant understanding the rhythm of the music and fitting your steps perfectly within it. It was about timing. He also wrote about memoria, memory. The choreographies were long and complex. You had to memorize the sequence of simples, doubles, reprises, and brandles. A basse danse was a test of your memory and your concentration. But the most important quality was maniera, style. This was the graceful, effortless-looking quality that distinguished the true aristocrat. It was in the posture, the way you held your head, the placement of your arms. It was In the walk itself, you did not just clump along, you glided, you moved from the hips, keeping your upper body calm and stable. The feet were turned slightly out, the steps were smooth, with the feet staying close to the floor. This stylized walk was a performance of social status. In a world without mass media, your body was your billboard. The way you walked into a room, the way you moved on the dance floor, it told everyone who you were. A smooth, controlled, graceful walk signaled that you were a person of leisure, someone who did not have to perform manual labor. It was a physical manifestation of nobility. The dance historian and reconstructionist Liebart van Gort has emphasized that we should think of these dances less as dances in our modern sense and more as choreographed deportment. It was a training in how to be a noble. The skills you learned on the dance floor, the posture, the grace, the control, were skills you were expected to apply to every aspect of your life. So, the most forgotten move might be the most subtle one. The specific muscular control, the precise distribution of weight, the exact degree of turnout in the feet that constituted the perfect courtly simple. It is something that can't be written down. It can only be learned by watching and imitating. And the people who knew it, the people who embodied that perfect noble walk, have been gone for 500 years. What questions does this leave us with? How long did it take to learn this walk? Was it something you practiced from childhood? Could you spot an imposter, a nouveau riche merchant, by a subtle flaw in their walk? And when the nobles left the great hall and walked in their private chambers, did they relax? Did they drop the performance? Or was the stylized walk so deeply ingrained that it became second nature, an inseparable part of who they were? Number 1. What if the dance was silence? We have been searching for moves, for steps, for the physical actions of dance. But what if the most profound and forgotten part of medieval dance was not a move at all, but a moment of stillness? Think about the structure of the dances. The basset danse was a sequence of movements. But between those movements, there were pauses. The reverence at the beginning was a moment of stillness before the action began. Our prizes, a step back, could be followed by a brief halt before the next forward movement. These pauses were not empty time. They were charged with meaning. In a couple dance, a pause was a moment for a glance to be exchanged. It was a moment of tension, of anticipation, what would happen next. The music would continue, creating a contrast between the audible rhythm and the visible stillness. In that gap, the unspoken drama of the dance would unfold. It was in the stillness that the courtly love ideal, with its emphasis on longing and restraint, was most powerfully expressed. The Italian masters understood this. Domenico da Piacenza's choreographies are full of moments where one dancer moves while the other is still. This contrast, this interplay of motion and stillness, was a key part of the art. The stillness was as choreographed as the steps. It was a move in itself. This idea connects to a broader medieval aesthetic. Look at the architecture of a Gothic cathedral. It is a balance of solid stone and empty space. Look at Gregorian chant. It is a balance of sound and silence. The medieval mind understood the power of the void, the importance of the pause. Dance was no different. We lose this when we focus only on the steps. We try to reconstruct the movement, but we forget to reconstruct the stillness. We can read the instruction, perform a double, but we cannot read the instruction for the silent, fleeting moment that came after it. The quality of that stillness, was it relaxed, tense, flirtatious, respectful, a deliberate, meaningful, and performative lack of movement? It is the hardest thing to recover, because by its nature it leaves no trace. We can analyze the footprints, but we cannot analyze the moments when the feet did not move at all. This leaves us with the most fundamental questions. How long do these pauses last? A single heartbeat, a full measure of music. Was the decision made by the dancers in the moment a spontaneous choice, or was it dictated by convention? And what was happening in the minds of the dancers and the audience during that moment of shared stillness? Were they admiring the dancer's pose? Were they interpreting the social drama? Or were they, for just a second, simply holding their breath together, caught in a silent, shared rhythm? The final secret of medieval dance might not be in how they moved, but in how they stood still.